You have to celebrate your failures. You can't, I think it's the hardest thing for some people to do is to shut down a company. But what we tell the entrepreneurs is, you really want to spend your time working on something that's not going to work. It's your opportunity cost. Yes, it's our capital cost, but it's your opportunity cost to be working on something that, you're trying to beat a dead horse here. So thinking through what is the information you need to make that decision and seeking that truth, if you will, is really important part of it.
This is the Nucleate Podcast, the voice of the next generation of biotech leaders.
Welcome to the Nucleate Podcast. My name is Sam Kessel, and on this episode, I speak with Peter Barrett, partner at Atlas Venture. Peter is dedicated to advancing innovative therapeutic and drug discovery companies, leveraging decades of experience in biotech leadership and strategic development. Since joining Atlas Venture in 2002, he has been instrumental in creating and growing numerous ventures, including Synlogic, Obsidian Therapeutics, and Cadent Therapeutics, which was acquired by Novartis. His focus remains on translating groundbreaking science into impactful treatments for patients. Notably, he's no longer investing in companies himself. Previously, Peter co-founded Celera Genomics, where he contributed to his first successful sequencing of the human genome and drove strategic alliances and business growth. He also held senior roles at Celera, expanding its life science division through partnerships and acquisitions. As an executive fellow at Harvard Business School, Peter supports the development of future biotech leaders through the Blavatnik Fellowship Program. He holds a PhD in analytical chemistry from Northeastern University and a BS in chemistry from UMass Lowell. We're grateful to have Peter as a board member of Nucleate. I found this conversation fascinating, learning about Peter's career journey, the impact that he had on sequencing the human genome at Celera, and key lessons for entrepreneurs, as well as how Atlas approaches biotech investing. We hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much for joining us on the Nucleate Podcast today, Peter.
Well, thank you. I'm good to be here.
So let's start with your career prior to Atlas Venture. You spent roughly 20 years at Celera, involved with PCR and automating it, and you led significant expansions in the life science business for them. What lessons from this phase in your career can you share with us, and how did this prepare you for your current role now at Atlas?
Yes, well, a couple of things. Well, first of all, when I started at the company, it was called Perkin Elmer. It gets very confusing because it's not the Perkin Elmer of today. And we were in the scientific instrument business. And I started actually as a technical consultant in the field of inductively coupled plasmas, which was where my PhD was in analytical chemistry. And, although I had that specific role, one of my key things early was to figure out, what does a company do? What are all the other aspects? R&D, manufacturing, marketing. And so although I had that, specific job, I spent a lot of time visiting the other parts of the organization, talking to people and understanding how an organization works. And I think that was very valuable for me because, in fact, in later years, I moved up into various roles because of that. But it also gave me a broad sense of what a company does, and therefore leading me to those promotions, which gave me a lot of operational experience. And, operational experience is something that's valuable in VC, as well as, of course, many other aspects. And so that's the angle I came actually into VC was from this operational perspective.
It's really interesting that, you came in at a really technical role straight from your PhD. You were not in a business role to start. Curious, you mentioned that you connected with other parts of the organization. Was there any one moment where you realized, I want to move broader than my, technical type of work and into a broader type of business context when you were there?
Yes, it was actually, it was they who decided that, not me. So I had been working for, about 9 months in this role, and had made many trips down to headquarters, which was in Connecticut. And they offered me a job down there to join, was then the marketing organization, to, use my skills to really define what are the applications and who are the target audience for this product. So although I took the job in Boston because I didn't have to move, 9 months later, I was moving with a 1-year-old daughter down to Connecticut. So, and that, I'm very thankful, although it was not the easiest thing at that point in time. It really was probably the best thing that happened early in my career is actually having me there full time in headquarters, getting exposure to the rest of the organization.
That's a really interesting pivot point that you were able to physically be on site, and it sounds like it did help get to know people and interface with a broader set of the organization than you would have as a technical consultant.
Yeah, and I'd also say that, when I was leaving my PhD and interviewing for various jobs, it was pretty clear I didn't want to be in a laboratory. So I was looking for whatever opportunities that gave me a different role than, going back into the lab, working for example, Battelle Columbus Labs was one of the organizations that I had interviewed with, offered me a job, Procter & Gamble, where I would be analyzing consumer products. It was all fascinating to have those interviews, but none of it really caught my eye. And this was sort of I almost felt in the early days a stopgap. I'll take this role and then I'll figure it out later. And of course, I eventually did.
Well, it's kind of nice to hear that, you didn't have this career all plotted out from the beginning. I don't think it sounds like you didn't really envision yourself necessarily as a, biotech venture capital partner when you were graduating for your program at all. It sounds like you were just figuring it out one step at a time.
Yeah, and I obviously talked to a lot of students who looking for career advice. It's hard to know really what you want to do early on in your career, and I think you have to sort of jump in and see what really where your interests lie, what attracts you, where's your passion. I think that's really important, and obviously you really have to love your job.
Yeah, especially if you're working tons of hours over many years, better do something that resonates with you. Great. So after Aplera, you ended up co-founding Celera Genomics, key part of sequencing the human genome, to my understanding, in parallel with the Human Genome Project on a separate team. So curious what inspired you to co-found Celera. What was it like being part of, cutting edge, fast-paced organization like that? I know J. Craig Venter was, one of the leaders there as well. And I'm just curious how you thought about that experience and how that affects you today.
Well, so how it originated, you had mentioned that we were fortunate enough to be the ones to launch PCR into the research markets. And although the rest of the company had been not in biotech or not a biotech tool business, we started to acquire companies. So I acquired a company called Perceptive Biosystem, acquired Applied Biosystems, and we really built that up into a rather large and profitable business. But it became clear that there wasn't sort of the next thing to buy, at least at that stage. Of course, a lot of companies have grown up since then. And I was looking for, strategic opportunities downstream. And it was clear that what people really wanted was not our instruments. What they wanted was the information from our instruments. So that's where the sort of the cornerstone of the concept for Celera. And there were a lot of people at the company, thinking about this. And when we it evolved one day to, well, we'll sequence the human genome, because ultimately that will be, sort of really the start, if you will, of biological information that will help researchers, and it'll be a valuable asset. And you're right, at that point in time, the Human Genome Project was going along, but we felt it was much too slow. It was going to take many, many more years because of the strategy they were using. And that's where Craig came in and had developed this shotgun sequencing strategy, break it into pieces, sequence the pieces, and then put Humpty Dumpty back together again. We didn't know really if it was going to work, but I went to the board with this concept of creating what then I called the Bloomberg of biology, asked for $300 million. But even though it sounds like a lot of money, and it was a lot of money in those days, a lot of that money we would have turned around and bought back from the mothership, if you will. And in terms of sequencers, PCR, reagents that helped launch this. And it was really successful in the sense that it then invigorated, if you will, the Human Genome Project, and they started using the same strategy and buying sequencers as well. So it was a fascinating time, 14-hour days, trying to put everything together in a short amount of time. And working with Craig was interesting. He clearly a visionary, and the strategy that we all didn't know that was going to work, but he pushed the scientists to really make it work, and was successful at it.
It sounds like a fascinating time, and I'm curious to dig in a little bit more. When you said, you went, was it with Celera's board, and you asked them, hey, we want to create the Bloomberg of biology? Tell me a little bit more about like what you did to persuade them to invest a lot of money on. I don't know if it's like a separate company or a subsidiary at the time, but yeah, I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so it ended up being what's called a tracking stock. And so basically, and it's something that was used quite a bit at that time. Thermo Fisher had multiple tracking stocks. And so what it was, it'd be one corporate umbrella, but that the individual entities would have their own stock that would trade under one board of directors. So that was the structure. So we basically took 300 million from the balance sheet of Celera then and put it into Celera. And I think I think they were intrigued by the idea of creating this new business. Because again, at a point when you're generating a lot of profit, what do you do next? What is the next strategy for growth? And that's really what I was always focused on, is how do we grow more? And acquisitions were very successful, but what is the next big thing? And this evolved to be it. And I think the risk was small in a sense, because especially that we were buying the instruments and equipment back from the mothership there. So I applaud them for letting us take that risk in a time where there was some uncertainty.
And as I say, today, I mean, there certainly are big companies that do innovate, but I wouldn't say that most of the biggest innovations that we're seeing today come from giant corporations that create new companies. That it's relatively unusual.
Yeah.
And inspiring too, that you were able to convince them at the time to do something like this.
Yeah, it's we were pretty nimble at that point in time. We hadn't gotten too big. And it was we're still able to move pretty fast on certain decisions, which was helpful. And then, with the markets, really at that point in time were quite frothy, to say the least. We went out and raised $1 billion in less than a week. And but that changed the complexion, because the original investment thesis for the company was to create this information company. But when you have $1 billion in the bank, it just changes the perspective. And I had started to go out and acquire some companies in the space. Axis Pharmaceuticals we acquired. And we had been looking at some other ones, especially in the area of biology, because we wanted to sort of build up the capabilities of the company. And unfortunately, at that point in time, I think the board decided that some of those companies weren't worth what they thought they were worth. And that we were worth what we were worth, which was, at that point in time, I think that's when it sort of disillusioned me that this was something I should spend the next part of my career on, if we were all of a sudden going to become conservative, if you will.
Yeah, that's a great segue too, to the next phase of your career after Celera. I don't know if it's directly to Atlas right after that, or shortly after that you made a pivot from Celera into venture capital. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the transition from certainly from the operational side to the investing side, but also it sounds like the foundation of your career was really on the analytical side, the data gathering side, analyzing the human genome to more therapeutics. And it sounds like you did acquire a pharmaceutical company, but just curious if that was a big transition in terms of, understanding the different approaches to pharmaceuticals versus the analytical side, and as well as like the philosophical difference between, the operational side and more of like the advising consultative side, and achieving the greatest returns as an investor and building solid companies in pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, so it was, I guess it was 2001 when I had started to look for other opportunities. I was interviewing for a couple of different public company CEO positions. When I was introduced to Jean-Francois, who was then the only US partner in biotech at Atlas, and by a mutual friend. And so we got together for dinner, we talked about it, and he said, you should think about joining Atlas. And I said, well, I really don't know what a venture capitalist does, so I need to spend some time to think about this. And they and he were very generous. I got introduced to some of their limited partners to see how their perspective was in investing in firms like Atlas. I talked to some of their CEOs to see their perspective on Atlas and how it worked, and of course many conversations with the rest of the partners. We were a diversified firm at that point in time, so there were tech partners and life science partners. And I think I decided that this was intriguing. My first reaction was, okay, I'm not going to be a player, I'll be the coach. So I think I can do that, because I had started up many businesses within my previous career, and working with small teams and essentially being the coach. But of course I was player as well, player coach. So I thought that aspect was interesting. But the other point you made is like, okay, I'm not deep into understanding how the drug development process works. And that's when I learned that, this is a game that you rely on many, many resources. And at that point in time, we actually hadn't really determined that we were going to be pure therapeutics play as we are today. So they had invested in some diagnostics, some med devices, and some other things. And that's a whole other story that we learned our lessons the hard way. But, and we had a couple of smart associates that, had PhDs. And so I said, okay, back to school here. I can learn this.
I love that, back to school. But it sounds like you basically had to learn on the fly a little bit. I'm sure, obviously, some of the foundational things that you knew about running a business, like what elements makes a successful biotech-related company. And it sounds like the rest you kind of just figured it out as you went along, as you started Atlas. Is that right?
Yeah, and in fact, even today, even though I'm not currently making new investments, when an opportunity comes in, it's highly unlikely that you will know enough about that to make a decision. So you have to rely on many others. And of course, you never have perfect information anyways about making any investment. But that's where the strength of not only the internal team, but the rest of the portfolio. We rely on the rest of our portfolio. We have experts in CMC, preclinical work, toxicology, all across the portfolio. And so we leverage that resource. And of course, our relationships that we built over the years with experts in consulting and or even the biotech and pharma companies. Really important aspect.
So finding the wisdom of many different experts in order to make a well-reasoned decision. And I think you talked a little bit about this in the beginning, is minimizing the risks when you were starting Celera, like trying to find ways to de-risk an inherently risky process with expertise or knowledge or some sort of advantage.
Yes. And that's, really what we do at Atlas is you do as much diligence as, you think gets you to the right, at least thesis of what the investment could look like. And then depending upon the stage of the science, if it's real early, we're not afraid to spend, several $1 million just to test the hypotheses, sort of repeating it, if you will, in many cases in CROs and other, service-based organizations that will allow us to de-risk it or in sometimes shut it down.
Well, I mean, that makes sense. Inherently, when you're taking a risk, there's a chance that it doesn't work out. I mean,
Yes.
it's the business of home runs, right? So for every one success, I'm sure you have numerous failures, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to celebrate your failures. You can't, I mean, I think it's the hardest thing for some people to do is shut down a company.
Mhm.
But what we tell the entrepreneurs is, do you really want to spend your time working on something that's not going to work? It's your opportunity cost. Yes, it's our capital cost, but it's your opportunity cost to be working on something that, you're trying to beat a dead horse here. So thinking through what is the information you need to make that decision
Mhm.
and seeking that truth, if you will, is really important part of it.
That's really interesting. Celebrating your failures. And I mean, sounds like also you have to find some criteria to decide when you are beating a dead horse versus making another pivot. But it sounds like the failures are really important to learn from for both, the entrepreneur as well as the VC that's involved.
Yeah, and if through that process, the company gets shut down, we look for opportunities to place those individuals in the next thing. I'll give you a perfect example that I like to use is I was hiring in this startup that was based on one carbon metabolism. The idea was that, boy, if you could slow down the carbon source production, you're going to have an effect on tumor growth. They all need carbon to grow. And it was a little bit complicated biology in the mitochondria, but I hired a chemist from Novartis. And in the interview, he was quite reluctant to leave, the stable salary at Novartis to join this startup. And, I said, well, trust us. If this doesn't work, we'll move on to the next thing. And unfortunately, it didn't work. And we ended up, hiring him to look at some opportunities, help some other companies. And he started to develop a concept for degraders. And he is now the CEO of Chimera.
Oh, wow.
So it's a great story that, is just to show how, taking risks and jumping in can be a path to quite successful career.
And that failure isn't final in this business because it's unfortunately all too common with, you can't guarantee science is going to work in any given instance, but it sounds like it really worked out for him.
For sure.
That's great. And I think, certainly a lot of our audience, nucleate members and, founders often, have been succeeding all their life, right? Like getting straight A's in schools, getting into the top tier institutions, etc. But in the world of, startups and venture capital, failure is very common. And, to your point, there's a lot you can learn from it. And there's ways that it can enable you to succeed in the future.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit more about Atlas. So recently raised its 14th fund for $450 million. Curious to hear your perspective on it and how, what the approach will be on this one, if it's any different than prior funds. It seems like in the past, couple years, the biotech markets have been relatively in the doldrums. It seems to be some green shoots. It looks like things are starting to pick up in 2024 and hopefully continue to do so in 2025. But, on the whole, I'd say relatively risk averse market from what I've been seeing. So curious on how, you view this fund in the setting of, the current market conditions and how you think it's going to be looking moving forward.
Yeah, well, one of the things that, has been very important to us over the years is we established a strategy that really hasn't changed in recent years. And that is, first of all, that small is beautiful. We never think that venture can be scaled effectively. It's, all being around one table and even on every Monday with the entire investment team. So everybody gets to learn, everybody gets to know what's going on. And that returning capital on a smaller fund is certainly a lot easier than a $1 billion plus fund. So our LPs appreciated that as well, that is something we stick to. Of course, there are some LPs who would like to get into our funds that can't because we're not growing it, but that is something we've held pretty steadfast to. The other is that we focus only on therapeutics. We realized over the years that that's where our experience is, that's where our connections are, and focus is better than trying to venture off into these other adjacencies. And the third is that the strategy is simple. It's science first. So we look at the science, and it has to have the hallmarks of being able to change significantly a patient's life. And with that tenet, it makes it easier to focus on what you're going to invest on. So that hasn't changed. And you're right, the past couple of years have not been great in biotech, and that's mainly because of the flood of generalists that came in during COVID. All exited because it is a risky business, and it's not for the faint-hearted, for sure. But we continued through that period, and will continue to invest, in early startups with the same sort of strategy. I think if you will, the diligence and the fundamental analysis of these companies is a lot more stringent, but it hasn't changed really what Atlas is doing, for sure.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That the model has been successful, with the current size of funds, and I think some bigger funds that have been out there, as they increase in size, are not really able to maintain the high rate of returns that they were able to as smaller funds.
If you think about it, it's really hard because, if there's a certain number of partners and you want to pay attention to your investments, really you are now putting larger dollar amounts into each investment, which in some cases, if you win, is great, but the loss ratio can be painful.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And one thing that I've been seeing more of, maybe aside from Atlas, is there's been more repurposed assets that have been put into companies, and I think Celera is a good example of one that Atlas has done. Roivant makes her whole model on that. Curious any perspectives on that as an approach. It sounds like it's in Atlas's toolkit in addition to the early stage platforms.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it Celera you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't call that repurposed assets. I call that in-licensed assets. So
In-licensed assets, yeah.
A little bit different in the sense that those programs could be really the next generation of obesity drugs. And we were very excited to look at that portfolio and in-license and work with Bain, to launch that company. Purely repurposed assets, unless there is a real strong biological, hypothesis of why that's going to be different this time. We're not interested in that sort of incremental, because it's quote easier. Believe me, Celera is not going to be an easy one. But yes, so every partner has sort of his own license, if you will, to do what he feels might be a success here. And in this case, Michael Gladstone has been successful in doing that a couple of times, in licensing really strong assets, building the team around them, and selling them. Versanis was a great example of that. And so it's, I think that's what's a little bit different about our firm as well, is each of the partners are equal. They're paid the same. There's no boss, there's no CEO. Trust each other. So in the sense of, having license, if you will, to try some things, it's there. Obviously, there's scrutiny as the, future rounds, et cetera, come in, but it's just a really unique thing about Atlas compared to other firms where the structures are quite different.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's more of at the partner level, relatively flat structure in terms of how decisions are made and the ability to, you have license to take different approaches. Getting back to more of the early stage platforms, you've been on the board of companies like Obsidian, Synlogic. You've been involved with, Obsidian, for example, has a CAR T and TIL type of platform that can be used in a lot of different ways. Curious, from your perspective, having, invested in companies like this and built companies like this, how do you identify these types of platform technologies? What is the most important thing that you're looking for?
Yeah, things come in all different directions, right? Sometimes you read a paper and that's where Intellia got started, looking at editing. That was Cas9 editing. That was reading the dude in his paper. Other times, we are known well for venture creation. So people will come to us either as scientists or entrepreneurs who have got a hold of an asset or a program and come to us. So lots of different directions. And, if you take the Obsidian example, we were introduced to Tom Wanless, who is the scientific founder, if you will, of Obsidian. And when I say that, he had actually developed this technology to be able to control gene expression, and he was really using it for developmental biology. That's his area of expertise, so that he could turn genes on and off and see what effects it has on the development of different organisms. And the thought was, could this be applied to actually turn on and off genes in a therapeutic potential? So we spent some time thinking about that and thinking about what applications you might want to do that. And it led us to thinking about cell and gene therapy, where these therapies are very complex and really, in some cases, unknown about the effect they'll have once you introduce them into a human. So wouldn't it be great if we could control them not only on and off, but in a sort of like with a rheostat or a dimmer switch of what level of expression or therapeutic effect. And to us, the first application we thought of was CAR T, because, CAR Ts at that point in time were very toxic, and the patients were all in the ICU with cytokine storms. And could we make a difference there? That's where we initially did that license with Celgene. But being a platform, it was like, okay, what do we do next? And that's where we went on to develop at this point our own engineered TILs. So they come in different directions, and we look at it, as I said earlier, is, if this works, what is the potential for this? And the potential there, we seem very broad in the beginning. I think there's going to be some very important therapeutics are going to come out of it, but it's probably not as broad as we thought initially. You mentioned Synlogic. Synlogic was the concept of engineered bacteria to develop a therapeutic effect, but more importantly, to develop it in the gut. And if you think about a lot of diseases of the gut or the intestinal tract are trying to be treated via systemic therapies where there's side effects. And so the thought was, if we could treat them locally, we might be able to have better, therapeutic index by treating them at the source. I still think it's a fascinating, technology. I hope others carry it on, but unfortunately, the early applications that we had of the technology did not pan out as expected.
Got it. So being able to, be science first, make sure that, you believe in, the technical approach and understanding the risks that are involved, and seeing the broader application for how it's going to impact patients at scale. And I guess to your point, that there will always be a narrowing of that as a platform is developed further.
Yeah, when I think the word platform became very popular because people think it would be more valuable. We're always skeptical about whether things are really a platform until at least you see N of 1 work. Mm-hmm. And then maybe when N of 2 works, you can call it a platform. But if you think about it, whether it's a platform or not, if you create a important therapeutic out of whatever technology it is, that's a win. It doesn't have to be a platform. And I think what's hard about platforms is that, you're always struggling with trying to go too broad to prove it works without going deep enough. and it's an expensive game. So that's why you see a lot of people retreating to asset-centric type deals, which of course are more binary in nature. So
Yeah.
either end of the spectrum is difficult. So it's not like there's a panacea of one of these models is definitely the best way to go.
And it sounds like even, for the platforms that are getting invested in today, that they do have to be, to your point, more asset centric. They have to be more focused on developing their lead. And probably today compared to 5 years ago when you were in a more of a bull market in biotech, you could probably get away with spending a lot more money, developing the platform versus today it's more what can we do to advance our lead and, have targeted, investment in the platform as well.
Yeah, I think if you're pitching one of those approaches, you really have to show why you think that the first application is going to work and it's going to be significant enough value, because that's what most investors will invest in, understanding that yes, there is potential for upside in the broader sense, but let's make sure that the fundamental basis for this technology is going to work in an important therapeutic area.
That makes a lot of sense. It would be good to talk about, Obsidian or maybe one of the other companies that you've been on the board of. Can you talk about a particularly impactful experience when you were on the board and making a key decision and how you approached that decision and what the results were?
Yeah, there's I guess I can point to a few examples. One is I'll go back in time, is Alnylam. I was an early investor in Alnylam. And when we invested, it was very early in that technology, and there was no CEO. We were really at the point of a few investors working together to understand the intellectual property landscape for RNAi, which was quite complex at the point in time. But when it came around to hiring a CEO, there were a couple of different opinions on what profile we needed. And I felt that we really needed someone who was more going to be an evangelist for the technology because it was so early. And yes, it worked in the research markets, but to convert something like that into a therapeutic. So I was really pushing for John Maragoni to take that role. And others, felt like a safer, maybe less costly at this point in time CEO. They were putting that individual's name up, but I really, sort of not put my foot down, but try to influence the others that this was the right choice. And, fortunately that one was a real win. And I think a lot of the decisions in the boardroom come down to that are very important is the CEO decisions. So at least a couple times in my career, I've had to go into the CEO's office and explain that we were letting him go, and explaining those reasons and convincing the board beforehand, of course, that that was the right thing to do. A lot of boards don't like to make that decision because it's a hard decision and it's disruptive. But most of the time, when you are procrastinating those decisions, you look back and, boy, we should have made this earlier, because you just see the difference of getting someone who's more suitable. And I want to be clear that in a lot of cases, the individuals that I let go were clearly, experienced people with a lot of strengths, but not for that particular company at that particular time. So that's something that I think that's really important, is the leadership. And that's really one of the board's most important roles, is the decision for who is going to be the leader in that company.
And that's really interesting too. Like hard to evaluate right and wrong, I guess, like at the moment, right? Like it takes a little bit of time to figure out, a CEO decision, certainly if you're going to be hiring. In the case of John Maragoni and Alnylam, worked out phenomenally well for everyone involved and for patients especially ultimately. But it's interesting that you said it's more about fit than anything, right? Like that, you could have someone who's very capable on paper of doing the job, but finding the right CEO fit for that company to solve the unique problems that is faced with is very interesting.
Yeah, it's we see that all the time, because when you start a company, the skill set may be just pure execution on a scientific program. And then when you evolve and become public, it's much broader. There's a few people, and I mentioned earlier, the CEO Chimera can make that transition, but not many can go from, being the scientific leader all the way through to running a public company, which is okay. Just know what you're good at.
It sounds like very fundamentally different skill sets and very unique type of person who can really transition from spending much time in one to the other.
Yeah, and being a CEO is a pretty lonely position. So, and as you get promoted to CEO or become CEO, it is the things that you might have really liked doing in a startup or in a other company. You may not be able to do them as much because you're talking to investors, you're, doing things that are just outside of the things that you probably grew up loving doing in your career.
That makes a lot of sense. I'd like to talk a little bit more about Atlas and its role in supporting entrepreneurs and new technologies. How do you feel like what do you think Atlas does that's unique in terms of supporting entrepreneurs and developing new technologies that perhaps others don't do?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, there are very few companies that do venture creation, and the ones that do it, all do it in different ways. The way we do it, and we think works really well, is that, again, we're not afraid to start a company with really no management, just some people to help test scientific hypotheses. And we will start it in our office right down the hall, and we'll be actively involved, not only the partners, but the investment team, in helping that company through those formative stages. And it's very personal in a sense. Now, there are other VCs that try to do this at scale, which, they do it, but it's maybe less personal than the direct connection we have with our companies. And there's others that do venture creation that are creating big platform companies, which, it's hard to kind of do in your office.
Yeah.
So I think that part is unique. And then I think we, as I mentioned earlier, for those companies that fail, we're very supportive of, finding the next chapter for those who spent their time with us in finding out, whether something was going to be successful or not. So I think those are a couple of the important things. We also try to get the portfolio expertise get together. So for an example, we'll hold a dinner for the chief scientific officers. When I say hold a dinner, we'll pay for it. We won't even go, but we'll just help organize those events where they can create their own community and their own network, that it becomes very supportive when they have questions that are sort of outside, or they're just looking for advice from other people in their field. Do that with chief business officers, financial officers, CEOs. And I think that's really important part of what we try to do.
And that sounds really interesting, that you find ways to connect your portfolio companies together for them to get learnings from each other. And it sounds like in that instance of the dinner is pulling back, getting out of the way so that the connections can happen.
Yeah, every year we hold a retreat, which is where we invite, top people from pharma and biotech to a meeting talking about the latest topics. We had Scott Gottlieb this year, which was very timely. But we also, the night before, we actually have a meeting of all our CEOs with an outside facilitator. So they choose what, and we don't go to this part of the meeting, they choose what the topics they're interested in. And sometimes it's how do you build a great board, or how do you interact with your investors, whatever it be, they come up with that, and they run this meeting, or the facilitator, who's really important part of our organization, runs that part of the meeting, and we don't even hear what happened in there.
Yeah, that's great. Just being able to foster that connection, those candid conversations, and so that your portfolio companies can navigate them together.
Yeah, I think and they really appreciate it as well.
That's great. Now, going to the next part of that theme in terms of connections and collaboration, when you're thinking of the broader biotech ecosystem, what do you think needs to change in the biotech ecosystem in order to remain innovative, especially in a more challenging market like the one we're dealing with now?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think if you look at the simple ingredients that it takes to build a great company, it's whatever that innovative idea is. It's the talent, it's the capital. There never seems to be a shortage of innovative ideas out there. So when people say, what do you do for deal flow? That's not the issue. It's the other components. And if you think about capital, there is a lot of capital out there, but it's really for select number of investments, right? Mm-hmm. So the hardest part for starting a company is getting that initial funding so that you have enough capital to get entrance from a more serious investor. So I think government grants are something I encourage entrepreneurs who I may be mentoring is an important thing. Angel investing in some cases. So ability to get that early stage capital, and some states provide it, some countries provide it, I think is an important part. I think the hardest part for the industry is talent. There's no question. And how do we educate more people? And Nucleate, I think, is doing a great service to the biotech ecosystem to do that, to provide that. But we need talented people who can run these companies, because it's hard enough when you're trying to build these without experience. So I think those are the components. What has evolved nicely is the amount of external services that you can sort of run virtual companies before you need to raise enough capital to bring things in-house. So that de-risking phase is a lot easier to do, because you used to have to essentially build it yourself. But that over the last couple of decades has become a lot easier to do.
Yeah, that's great. And I agree. I know not the focus of what you were just going through, but I think Nucleate does build a great community. And I think those resources, kind of like what you're describing with the Atlas portfolio, I think Nucleate tries to do something similar with the Activator program and connect alumni together in order to support each other. And, definitely makes sense that talent is, in short supply. There's not that many people, I think, to the point that you mentioned with the CEO of Chimera, not that many people who understand the science and can also parlay that into running a business. It's not a very common trait. Yeah,
it's absolutely true.
So when we're talking about some of the entrepreneurs that you've advised over in the past, what are some of the important skills that you advise as they are in the initial stages of starting a biotech company?
Yeah, good question. I think number one is, what analytical skills are really important, right? The ability to look at data and be questioning all the time. So that mindset of not only understanding it, but questioning what else, or what could we have done more, or does this really paint the picture? So thinking outside the box and from an analytical way. And I think analytical skills are key. I think the other thing is hiring people who you're not threatened by, right? Meaning don't be threatened by the people you hire. a lot of people get worried about, oh, that's a really smart person, maybe he's going to take my position. It's a team sport, and you need the best athletes, if you will, on board in order to do that. And so hiring, the best of the best, if you can get them, which is sometimes very hard in the early stages, is really important to bring in the expertise. And don't try to think, well, I can learn some of these really difficult areas that you just don't have the experience in. Don't fake it, right? And then tenacity. It's a really hard sport you're going to play, and you have to be tenacious to get funding, to find the right talent, to get answers to questions that are going to help you decide how you're going to execute on the program next. All those components, I think, are important. And, in some ways, people always say leadership. Well, if you're doing those things right, you're a leader.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, to the point that you're making on hiring people that are smarter than you, ideally you're putting together a team of complementary skill sets, right? That inevitably you're going to hire someone who knows something that you don't know, and they're amazing at it, right?
Yeah.
Do you find that often, though, that entrepreneurs are nervous about hiring people where that person has a skill set that entrepreneur may not have or has little insight into? Is that a common challenge that you found with your startups?
I want to use the word common, but certainly, I've seen it. I've seen just people who are afraid to go out and hire really strong people. And others are, absolutely unabashed by it. They want to get that expert on their team. And I think that's, you can't compromise, and don't just hire someone because you have that slot to fill. Don't compromise on that. If you have to, use consultants for the meantime, or your network for the meantime, but make sure you're getting the right information in order to make decisions that, are going to really affect the company.
Great. And so on that theme of, advice for entrepreneurs, what is advice that you give to entrepreneurs, but they just don't seem to be able to actually take that advice? Is that, I don't know if there's one thing that comes up where, everyone says that, the same piece of advice and it's just not resonating with that entrepreneur, or entrepreneurs have difficulty implementing that advice?
I would say one is that, when you put an entrepreneur in a position, let's say they're CEO of this startup, is be transparent and make sure you leverage your board. A lot of times they feel that they need to act like they know what they're doing and try to make this work without asking for help. And that's really the worst thing you can do. And I've seen it too many times that they feel that they were given this position as CEO, so therefore they must try to figure this out. That's what your board should be there for. We're all in the same boat. It's not like we're sitting there waiting to fire that person. We want to make this company work. And so you may come to us, if you're being transparent with a specific challenge, maybe we know someone who we can get to consult with you, or maybe we've seen that situation before, or maybe you've been trying to get in to Novartis or some other company for a BD discussion. Well, we can make that introduction for you. But too often, or when negative data comes, they want to sort of sit on it and try to figure it out, and what are we going to do next? We see negative data all the time. So let's talk about it and, think through, okay, what does this mean? Does this mean the experiment was run wrong? Does this mean that, we were using the wrong model? What does it mean in context of what we need to do and what are our options? Again, people, on the board have a lot of experience from seeing those different situations in many different contexts. So let them help. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid.
It honestly sounds like the opposite advice of fake it till you make it. It's be honest and transparent and ask for help when you need it.
Yeah, you don't want to fake. In this world, you don't want to fake it. when we see someone come in for a pitch and we ask a question and they're faking it, that's the end of your interest in investing in them. Be honest, say, I really don't know the answer to that. And if you have at least an idea, you can offer it, but start with, I really don't know the answer to it. I can find it out, or my thought is that this may be what's happening in this case, or this may be the cause, but let me figure that out. Don't fake it. It's the worst.
That's great. I mean, from what I hear of people who give that advice, it's really about be confident, present yourself well, but to the point.
Oh, yeah.
Be honest too.
Yeah, you can present yourself very confident that you don't know it. Yeah.
That makes sense. I like that. So if you had to summarize your career, if there's one important message or insight that you want our audience to know about your career, what would you like to share, if any?
Well, I guess if I reflect back on my career, I've been really lucky to work with some great people. Bruce Booth and Jean-Francois have been my partners. I mean, certainly we've hired them, but for the hard years when biotech was really hard in the first part of the decade, it was great working with them. I had a lot of opportunities at my first company. It's really unusual for people to only work in two companies, but I'm quite glad that I had the opportunity to work in both of them because the contrast was great and the opportunities were great. I think, what to me is really important is to really love what you do. And, when people ask me about the career and venture, I said, it's a field where there's so much innovation, so you can see really at the cusp of what's happening. You get to choose what you want to work with and the people you want to work with. And ultimately what we do in therapeutics is social good. And there's not many jobs that you can say that you have those components. And of course, if you do well in those aspects, you can do okay financially as well. So it's been really great from that perspective. So I wouldn't trade anything for what I've done over those 40 plus years.
That's great insight. And one thing that I found interesting, I was reading your bio, I think it's on the US Lowell website. It's an interesting story. You talk about loving your career, yet you still find time to do other things and prioritize family. And the story that I found really interesting is that you were invited to the White House, going back to like our initial discussion about the sequencing the human genome. And after the human genome was sequenced, you were invited, I believe, by Bill Clinton to join the White House, but you prioritized family over doing that. Can you give a little snapshot of that? Because it's a really interesting story.
Yeah, it was back when they were going to announce, they decided it was politically correct to announce Celera and the Human Genome Project at the same time, which was interesting in itself. And we had planned this 50th anniversary of my parents' wedding to go on a cruise. It was my first and last cruise, but that's a whole separate subject. And, it was really our extended family. It was my siblings and their children. And, there was going to be 25 of us on this cruise. And that was the opportunity to go to the White House or do that. And to me, that was no choice whatsoever. I went on this cruise. So the cruise part wasn't nice. Being with family was really, really special. So, you can look back on those times and what's hard about our business is everybody works hard. And when you have a family, there are times when you can look back and say, boy, I wish I had prioritized family in those circumstances versus thinking I had to go to that meeting. I had to be the one. I couldn't have sent someone else. And I have as many times I can think back of, boy, I wish I was at that game for my son or something else instead of, feeling like I had to go to that meeting in California.
Yeah. Yeah, and that resonates too with me. You know, I don't think I've ever regretted going to a family event. And I know they will sometimes inevitably conflict with work. It's the nature of our business, right? We're very busy, you know.
Yeah.
Biotech is a very intense, you know, profession in general. There will always be more meetings. There will always be more events. But I thought that was a really great story that, you know, even as big as going to the White House, you still prioritized a family event over that. Uh,
Yeah. It's funny when you leave a position too, like I only did once, but you feel like you were such an important part of that company, and then you get replaced and it goes on. So life goes on,
mhm.
we're all replaceable.
Yeah. And you know, one last question on the, you know, outside of work part, that you're an avid competitive sailor. Curious if you have any lessons that you've been able to apply to your a career approach, or just how it integrates with your career.
Well, it's a nice change for my career. There's a lot of interesting aspects. So I actually only started racing in 2008 when I joined this club that had sailboats that I could jump on and try. And I really wasn't very good. But over the years, I got better, and I started sailing with my son, and then my daughter got married, and her husband then wanted to sort of join in, so we started to become a team. And you know, being not so good in the beginning, it's natural to sort of be telling each other what to do and trying to do each other's job. And we had a coach that said, do your job. And that really resonated to me. And you think about it in your career perspective of do your position. Don't try to be doing everybody else's position. And that's when we started to become really better. And now there is no talking on the boat, basically, other than important information from other boats and other stuff, the wind, etc. But everybody's doing their job and it just executes. And when you see that happen, you realize that that's how companies should work, right? They should work by the management team, each doing their own thing. Of course, communicating important information between each other, but the execution just happens naturally. So, and of course, we've been much better since we started down that path.
That's great. And you know, focusing on what you need to do, obviously communicating when you need to on the important things, but being laser focused sounds like it was the key there to success.
Yeah, it's a great sport, especially if you get to do it with my family. It's really special.
That's
Not
fantastic.
many family sports you can do together, especially at my age.
Yeah, that makes sense. And a really great one to get in the outdoors, get on the water, get out of the office, and really have a nice change of scenery.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that was really a respite sometimes from the work aspect is when you're in a race and you can't think about anything else. The concentration is pure focus if you want to do well, because obviously there's situations where you could get in trouble, but also that micro changes in the wind, if you're not paying attention, you slow down. So all those little adjustments that you need to make requires, really complete focus. And you can't think about what a bad day it was yesterday. So it's a nice change, certainly a nice change.
Yeah, getting to be able to be fully immersed. I don't know if you'd call that flow state, but sounds like something close to flow state where you're just fully embedded in what you're doing. You're not thinking about your due dates or whatever's next, just being in that one moment. Sounds really refreshing.
Yes, it's awesome. I recommend it.
Excellent. Oh, well, I really appreciate the time, Peter. Thank you for speaking with us at Nucleate, and thank you for being a member of the board and continuing to help with the organization.
You're welcome, Sam. It's been a really special part working, since the beginning with the Nucleate team.
Thanks for listening to the Nucleate Podcast. Be sure to subscribe if you'd like to keep up with future episodes. See you next time.